Hi, good morning or good evening, depending on what part of the world you're in right now. I'm Rick Holland. I'm the Chief Information Security Officer here at Digital Shadows, and I'm joined by my colleague Isidoros, who's based in Athens, Greece. So we have a global team presenting today, and we're going to talk about some things that we've done internally that we thought we might share broader. And I'm going to start off with my biggest threat model item right now, my children. In fact, one time this week, we had 4 different WebExes going or Zooms all at the same time in the house. It can be quite distracting. In fact, I'm making this as a joke, but actually a real disclaimer. I was a Forrester analyst prior to this, and so I've probably done 100 or so webinars over the past 8 years. I've never done one live with a 5 and 7-year-old in the house. They did just have breakfast 2.5 hours ago, and I did give them a snack just a little while ago, but I suspect they'll come back in for feeding time. So I'm hopeful that we can avoid them coming in and requesting snacks, but I just want to set the expectation that I might have an invasion of the webinar. So my apologies if that happens, and I'll just adapt and overcome if that is the case. But I suspect a lot of folks can empathize with that, with animals, children, deliveries. It is an interesting world that we're in right now. I would not call it work from home. It's very different than traditional working from home. What we were going to cover today is 3 main areas. I'm going to talk pretty quickly about some of the threat actor activity that we have seen. A lot of it you will have will be intuitive to you, so we kind of want to focus into threats to the workforce, and I'll cover that as well. And then Isidoros will go through mitigating, and then I'll come back and wrap us up and close out right as we head into questions. Again, if you do have questions, just almost said Slack, but put them in the chat panel, and we will look at them. So first thing I want to do is start off with threat actor targeting. Fans of Jurassic Park or people that see me present before, I use this slide fairly often. In the movie, Dr. Ian McDonald says, life finds a way, and here at Cybercrime finds a way. The criminals always find a way to be opportunistic, to thrive despite takedowns from law enforcement, despite getting doxxed by security researchers, whatever the case may be, they find a way. And it's the same thing in this current situation. When it comes to the targeting, I'm going to start off talking about COVID-19, because that's really been the initial targeting that we've seen over the past, well, longer than a month, but certainly in the past month, while much of the world was moving to fully remote working. One thing I will say is largely the activity that we are seeing ourselves directly and then being observed in the broader community, it's consistent targeting. When a global event happens, Brexit, presidential elections, Olympics don't really apply right now since they're not going to happen, but historically, the Olympics, World Cup, that sort of stuff, you will see these being used in the campaigns from threat actors, both cyber criminal as well as nation state. And we're certainly seeing that now. I think the difference is the world is a captive audience. It's almost like a perfect storm. I would say desperate for information is probably an appropriate term. So if we see emails that or tweets, that sort of stuff related to it, we're probably much more inclined to click on it than we have been in the past. And the cyber criminals finding a way or taking advantage of that. Some of the 3 things that we saw initially when we started tracking this was phishing, obviously, as we'll dig into several times more in the presentation today. But we just there's a screenshot from one of our search capabilities called Shadow Search within our data, and it's got domain registrations from March on, and you can see a big spike there. You can see them start to tail off, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later on in the deck. But phishing spike, COVID stuff all over the place. We also seen a lot of scams. We're not going to dig into this. We have a podcast on it, and we have other content, but this is talking about people that are scamming with all the goods that we can't get on Amazon or Walmart, from toilet paper to surgical masks, to medicines, to testing kits and things like that. You've seen the drug dealers shift to try to have treatments for COVID-19 as well. And then we're also seeing misinformation. You're seeing misinformation for the lulls that are just bad guys that want to just cause kind of anarchy, so to speak. You're also seeing reports of nation state misinformation campaigns and things along those lines, which makes sense because misinformation is just kind of status quo these days. But this has been the large initial reaction to it. And one of the things that those of you that are familiar with Mark Cuban, owner of the Dallas Mavericks, here where I'm located, also on Shark Tank, Mark Cuban came out last week and was saying that COVID-19 and the pandemic represents an opportunity for entrepreneurs to try to do business in a unique way. Cyber criminals mirror the traditional economy as well, so it's a great opportunity for profit for them, and they're adapting as well. They're making their online shopping easier. They're actually also, if you're ordering goods and things like that, they're talking about how they're cleaning them and trying to disinfect them so that you don't get infected with COVID potentially from them. We have a couple quotes here, 2 English language and then 1 Russian language forum where criminals are talking about scamming people. We have observed a mix. There's been some examples of ransomware gangs that say, hey, we're going to hold off on extorting healthcare. But we see a lot of criminals that are looking to make money on this situation. And here's a couple examples of forums that are people that are offering up suggestions on how you can take an email from a local municipality, craft your own phishing lure with that, other as a service where people will design websites for you so that you can do this, that sort of thing, to really take advantage of it. This is pretty typical. In fact, Microsoft Mystic recently came out with some stuff earlier in the week or late last week, just talking about how they're just seeing the traditional infrastructure pivot to COVID things, not necessarily that we're seeing more, it's just all the resources are shifting in that direction, and that's aligned with what we see as well. Here's an example, and many of you may have used this Johns Hopkins distribution map. Although you can tell by the screenshot here, this was quite some time ago because the red is in a lot more places than just China. But basically here, what we had is in this Russian forum, XSS, which is a very popular Russian forum, an individual that's got a malicious attachment for an email that purports to be this Johns Hopkins map, but instead it can do something evil. There. In fact, they also, as a very nice thing, and they do have video. You're seeing this, you probably heard it within the ransomware where they have help desk and things like that set up so you can set up Bitcoin so you can pay the extortion fees. The criminals in general are trying to lower barriers to make their tools and services easier to use, and this is a good example of that as well. And we're continuing to see lures, social engineering around World Health Organization, this Johns Hopkins map, and other sources of information across the globe. We also see the nation state actors getting into the mix on this as well. Russia, Iran, China, Pakistan, and India have all had some sort of lures, domains related to COVID-19 in their tactics. We're not going to dig into this. I did highlight a threat report that we put out for our clients on the activity that we were seeing, and then also is being reported more broadly. If that's something you're interested in, we have a poll at the end of the webinar today where you can flag for follow-up, and that's something that we could provide to you as well. What we wanted to do now is kind of shift into threats to the actual workforce. And threat modeling is something I would say from my time at Forrester, and certainly in the 4 years that I've been in Digital Shadows, is an opportunity for companies. And threat modeling can get quite complex. If you come from an application security or a developer background, you will be used to threat modeling your application and looking at the interfaces and vulnerabilities and risks there. We wanted to keep it simple. MITRE's got some nice research on threat modeling. NIST has a framework for threat modeling. For those familiar with the Bank of England's CBEST program, there's some threat modeling with respect to intelligence and adversaries and that as well. There's a lot of different options for threat modeling. What we did is we did a tabletop exercise before things really hit the fan here. And we started having conversations, and some of it was just business continuity, but then we started talking about what are the threats that we need to look at. And then once we shifted to fully remote, it was like, wow, we really, you shift from planning and tabletop to execution mode. And so these are the kind of things that we came up with internally. So Issy, who runs the security team for me, and then Craig, who's our head of IT, these are the kind of areas that we brainstorm with our collective teams on and wanted to share them with you. Many of these will not be breaking news at all, as in our first one, phishing. How many people would be shocked to hear phishing is something that should be at the top of the threat model? Obviously, with me talking about the COVID-19 domain registrations, it's clear that one of the angles there is for phishing on those domains. So that's not going to be a surprise. What I think the transition, and I talked about, if you looked on that graph where it goes down, the lures are starting to change, and oh boy, are there some options for the bad guys to use lures. We have all the stimulus that's now starting to get paid out in the United States. Other countries are also doing stimulus. You also have the bailouts. So if you're in one of the industries getting bailed out, if there was an email that was sent out saying, hey, airline industry, here's the latest and greatest. If you're a pilot, I look across the street and I have a pilot across the street from me, maybe that's something he would click on. Healthcare in the US, if someone is trying to extend their benefits via COBRA, which would not be cheap, you perhaps might see something there on COBRA benefits. And then certainly anything related to employment with so many people unemployed. So things from the Department of Labor, Department of Commerce, your local state unemployment offices. There's just a lot of options for the bad guys. And two examples that I included here, many of you will be familiar with MITRE ATT&CK. These are two of the initial access components of that model, spear phishing attachment and spear phishing link. Attachment would be that John Hopkins lure that I mentioned. That's what would be there. So I think we really need to be on the lookout for these four things. Issy is going to talk about security awareness training a little bit later. Those could be nice things to roll into your security awareness training. Account takeover, also breaking news. Adversaries are going to continue to do account takeover. What I think might change a little bit for organizations is now there's a lot more options for account takeover. Many companies have started rolling out new software at a very fast pace. New SaaS applications, Zoom as one example, and we'll talk a little bit more about Zoom coming up. They're being rolled out and deployed. If they're not getting rolled into your single sign-on solution, then you have yet another set of passwords that are out there that could be reused from your employees with their corporate passwords to get into the environment. So it speaks to the importance of single sign-on, multi-factor authentication, stuff that Issy will dig into as we continue along. But that's increasing your attack surface, which is going to be a theme throughout our conversation today as well. Next one up, let's see, is something that I'm laughing because my kids are doing this right now. There's all these new applications that are getting installed. So just in the past week in my house, we have, I think, 18 passwords. I think is what my wife and I added up for the homeschooling for a kindergartner and a second grader, stuff for their classes, their teachers, their school. I also recently had my first telemedicine appointment and I had to create an account for that. So now people are creating even more passwords than they have used in the past. So more credentials, more opportunity for reuse, more opportunity to pivot into your environments. So I think this is something else that you should roll into your security awareness training to help people understand. And Izzy will talk about password managers when he gets to his component as well, which are helpful here. Attack surface. This is a big one for us in general. It's always been a big one, even from my days of covering vulnerability management at Forrester. You know, attack surface has not been particularly sexy or interesting, but it's absolutely critical, and even more so now. I kind of alluded to or mentioned Zoom before. We have all these new applications that people are deploying. It could be for remote meetings like Zoom. It could be for file sharing. It could be messaging like Slack or Teams. It could be project management tools like Trello. There's lots of new SaaS applications that are coming into the mix, new third-party applications that are coming into the mix. And think about Zoom. You know, Zoom has gotten a lot of negative press lately, but we've been talking about it internally, and we think Zoom will probably be one of the more secure SaaS applications within the next couple months. I've personally been impressed with Zoom's response and much more transparent than other organizations in this world when these sorts of things come out. But one of these applications increases attack surface, new code that could be vulnerable, misconfigurations in the way we deploy it, vulnerabilities in the code, new passwords. There's just a lot going on. One thing I would suggest to you is look at your key applications. If we gave the same level of scrutiny to them as we've given to Zoom, I think we might be a little bit unhappy with the results. I don't think Zoom is going to be that unique. I tie back to MITRE ATT&CK here, and they were talking about impact. There's a lot of different impacts that vulnerabilities or misconfigurations of these third-party applications could have, from availability of services to the integrity of our data, to using that to pivot in and exfiltrate data into the environment. Lots of opportunities there. So I get quite worried about attack surface. Another one is the accidental insider. I think we need to be more empathetic with our colleagues, employees in general, but now even more so. People are in new environments. Many of them are not used to working remotely, and they're just trying to get their jobs done. They likely have new tools, new services. They're working in a new space they may not be comfortable in. There's more complexity. There's potential for confusion. People could misconfigure a collaboration app. They could accidentally share sensitive information. They could email the wrong person. So I think our traditional accidental insider, the well-meaning employee trying to get their job done, makes a mistake, puts us at risk, is heightened and at a higher risk now. So I think education is important, but I really think transparent security controls and trying to help people understand how to use the new tools and services that we've deployed in this pandemic world. Now, family. I already made a joke about that, but let's come back to it because I've alluded to it a couple times. Right, our world that was largely separated, maybe for many corporate and personal, are completely blurred now. People are sharing phones, tablets, computers. As I mentioned, we had 4 WebEx sessions going at the same time on Wednesday this week, yesterday. Sometimes if families don't have enough computing devices, their children may have to use other devices. They could be installing applications, as I mentioned, that increase the attack surface. There's just a lot of risks here, and we need to be careful how we do that. You know, pragmatically speaking, people may have to share their devices. Izzy is going to talk about endpoint controls and the importance around, you know, controlling software inventory. That's important so that, you know, this telemedicine thing I installed, I'd never heard of it before. I don't know what the risks are. I didn't install it on this computer. On a personal one I did, but it was the attack surface. I actually uninstalled it as soon as I was done with it, but we need to know that. I actually want to do some photon research through our research group on that bottom bullet. Then we have the malicious insider. Fans of Jurassic Park will know, and Seinfeld will no doubt remember Mr. Dennis here. Dennis wanted to steal the embryos from Jurassic Park, put them in a shaving can, left, and he did not end up with a happy story, as he was killed by a dinosaur that's out there. Not a good ending for him, but sadly, in the COVID situation, with furloughs and layoffs, disgruntled employees, it really increases the likelihood for insider threat. And then couple that with potentially reduced visibility with the remote workforce, less tools for visibility for the workforce. Some parts of the world have less ability to even do analysis on insider threat. You know, some of our European customers are very limited in this area in general, but it's almost a perfect storm between the conditions to have upset employees and our lack of visibility and security controls to detect and quickly respond to it. That's something that we really need to think about. So I'm going to hand it over to Issy to kind of talk through controls. I'm going to stop sharing and pass the ball over to Issy, if I can figure that out. Making you presenter now.
Okay, thank you, and hopefully I will present my PowerPoint and not anything sensitive. Okay, can you see my slide?
Looks good to me.
Okay, cool. So, after having analyzed the threat and attack landscape and what threats and risks are related with remote working, let's move on to some fundamental, the most important according to our view, security controls, security recommendations that will help both end users and corporate environments improve the security posture around that new environment, new reality. First, we thought that it's a good time to mention and describe and highlight the importance of zero trust architecture, the zero trust model, which is actually the basic of what is being introduced here. Most of the controls are related or included in the zero trust model. So what zero trust architecture says, it says that we should not trust any entity inside or outside of our perimeter. Actually, the word perimeter now is being blurred, is being replaced, or is being moved actually to the end user himself. Traditional network perimeter now has been abused or violated by the new standards, the remote working environment, where actually perimeter now is defined by every end user working from home. That requires advanced visibility and IT controls to be supported and successful in a way to secure, manage, and monitor every connection, every access attempt, any activity in the corporate environment. In fact, zero trust nowadays is being tested more and more, very heavily, at a pace we wouldn't have otherwise done. Cloud services and companies with cloud-based collaboration tools have announced the increase on usage in a crazy rate. The point is that zero trust now is being tested, and more improvements are expected to be available in the future, where someone can start from doing an own assessment. A very good tool that has been released recently and is offered free by Microsoft is the Zero Trust Maturity Model Assessment, where you can see what components actually. We don't see anything new. The traditional network IT components are still there, but in another approach. With this self-assessment, someone can realize, can identify what tools and techniques can be used to improve or to develop a zero trust architecture, and also how the corporate environment stands in that point. Next one is the remote workers tool, the endpoint. A key fundamental security control here is the endpoint security hygiene. Every endpoint, either it is a corporate or a personal one, according to the company's policy, must be included in the continuous asset management control, in the continuous asset management program. Updated and patched software should be always the first priority. Every security incident, every security breach is being analyzed and is concluded with the recommendation: patch your software, patch your operating system, otherwise you are vulnerable to known or unknown attacks. Last, I have put here the adaptive multi-factor authentication. Multi-factor authentication actually is being analyzed later in the access control component, but here we need to highlight the adaptive part, which is actually an additional feature or component of the multi-factor authentication, adding an additional layer which has to do with preconditions that need to be met in an endpoint in order to get access to further authentication and authorization process. That incorporates a set of security configuration settings that are checked before the endpoint can be allowed to proceed to the authentication process. Next on the list is the advanced endpoint security controls. We talked and emphasized the endpoint native hygiene regarding operating system and applications installed. However, we need to add an additional, also important layer here, the next generation antivirus solutions, the so-called now EDRs, endpoint detection and response that offer improved and more reliable detection compared to traditional antivirus. Those solutions embed artificial intelligence and machine learning techniques, which makes them much more efficient and successful against common threats. We have tested internal in our components with very successful results, especially when we are talking to Windows operating systems. This technology, its nature, its cloud-based nature, makes also much easier the management, visibility, and continuous monitoring capabilities, which, as we have seen before with expanded landscape and with the zero trust network or model requirement, advanced visibility is a must-have in such occasion, in such cases. So in this, with this technology, these capabilities are much more efficient. Last but not least, again, is the incident response features. This is the last letter in the abbreviation, as you can see, the EDR, which actually makes another huge difference compared to the traditional antivirus solutions. Incident response feature offer a remote secure access, cloud-based secure access directly from the management console, from the incident responder to the endpoint, to the asset that is might be infected, offering remote incident investigation features and capabilities that otherwise are not available.
There's two things that I would add on to this one before you go on to the next. One is that second bullet point, cloud-based nature. One of the things that's been helpful for us in this switching from pandemic tabletop to pandemic response is that we're a very distributed, remote-friendly workforce. If we did not have cloud-based management of our various operating systems that we use, and we had to rely upon people VPNing in, when we have a lot of customers, a lot of employees that use SaaS applications, they don't necessarily need to VPN in anyway, that would be a challenge. So that's a very practical one that I think you should definitely look at. If you don't have a cloud model, see if you can transition to do that. That was a transition we made last year, and fortunate that we did that and got it in place. It's been quite helpful. The other bit that I would add on to this one is make sure to consider mobile devices as one of your endpoints. Traditionally you think of laptops, workstations as endpoints, but think about mobile devices as well. Now, if you think how busy we are, and maybe you're like me and you're with children and you're trying to help with school and you're working off of a phone or something like that, and you're accessing corporate resources, you're going to want to have visibility into those as well. So definitely think within the context of every computing device that has access to corporate resources, be it a corporate provided or a personal provided one.
Yeah, very good points. Thank you. Next on the list is something also very important that supports, and it is a fundamental component of the zero trust architecture, is the multi-factor authentication, which actually enhances in a very high and acceptable level the identity and access management as a security control or security principle. Of course, it's highly recommended. It involves actually in the authentication process above from something which is a traditional password, something you have, and or something you are. We know about tokens. We know there are technologies with push notifications, with OTP passwords or numbers, applications supported by smartphones. So these days it's much easier to support and to integrate the multi-factor authentication, even a cloud-based one, without requiring access or any significant change to the data center environment of an organization. This technology offers at the same time an advanced continuous monitoring and access visibility, which again, I repeat, it is a key part, an essential component of the zero trust network. A single sign-on solution on top of that, wherever this can be supported by applications or resources that can support such kind of access, it is also very important because it will eliminate the problem with password reuse in a way that authentication and authorization is being handled by an identity provider, which again, it is something that can be hosted on the cloud. So a cloud-based solution can also resolve such issues, removing common or reused passwords from the threat actor environment. Last, it is the password manager, which is something that can mitigate the problem where single sign solutions are not supported. With the password manager, the user can successfully use complicated and high complexity passwords as being auto-generated by the password manager and securely stored. Again, a solution that can be also cloud-based native.
One thing, just to call back to one of the things I talked about, because it's pain between me and my wife, is all these new passwords we have for school apps. Having a password manager that my wife and I can share just makes that much easier. And we have strong passwords, and they're not being reused with any kind of corporate password that I have or any personal Gmail accounts that she's using as well. So password managers, I think, will be quite helpful for those with telemedicine needs and lots of schoolwork needs for their family members.
Yes, exactly. Email protection. Another security control, very important, since email is the major threat vector for adversaries, for phishing or spear phishing campaigns. Someone should start from the email native secure hardening using available security settings like DMARC, SPF, and DKIM. Attachments also need to be properly filtered, and another useful technique that we have seen and used also internally is defending, which actually minimizes the threat of a malicious attachments, because it removes actually the attack vector from the application that is associated with the attachment. Links also included in the email body should also be handled properly. There are solutions out there, even cloud-based, where, for example, with the URL rewrite technique, a user can safely, let's say, click on a link, and after the link being inspected and filtered by the supported technology or solution, becomes available or not to the user for further access.
A couple things that I would add on to this one, just to build on the defanging. That's actually one of my favorite controls that we have at Digital Shadows. To make something into a PDF, you can then request the Word doc if you need it. Oftentimes the PDF is enough, although sometimes you can't copy and paste out of that PDF. So sometimes, even if it's really a PDF, you want to get it filtered so you can copy and paste out of it. But I think that's a really nice control. ISI runs our quarterly Purple Team assessments, and last year in Q3, we did one on the initial access phase for MITRE ATT&CK, and we had the red team side of the house was doing malicious email attachments, and that defanging component just stopped it in its tracks. So it was a very effective control for us. One other item that's not mentioned on here, and it's nothing you have to buy, is just configuring a tag on your subject line that says external for any email that's coming from the outside. Obviously, that's not going to necessarily stop anything bad, but it might make a user think once or twice more before responding to a particular email or clicking on something. So I like that control because it didn't cost us any money. Well, obviously we paid for our email filtering capability, but beyond that, it wasn't a tool. It was helpful for the employees, and it was a quick win and quick value for our security program.
Yes, actually it shows how a smart, small configuration change or setting can improve significantly the security level, especially in the email service. Next on the list is the digital risk protection. The definition of what digital risk protection is the monitoring and remediating external risk exposure online. We have described and analyzed before during the threat analysis that attack surface has been expanded significantly in a way now that the perimeter is defined by every end user. More and more third-party applications have been added on the mix of corporate supported services or resources. So we all realize that the attack surface has been increased in a way that risk is increased in a very unexpected way. So in the digital risk protection security control recommendation, what we need, what we aim is to minimize the attack surface and timely detect and respond to the risk. Such activities can include, and this is something we also highlight as part of our service and how digital risk protection can really support a zero trust network model, where visibility again is required as a key component for a successful implementation, is the phishing campaigns identification by detecting impersonating domains or phishing sites, attack surface weaknesses detection with open, unused or misused ports for applications or software as a service vulnerabilities, and exposed data detection with documents, code, or credentials that might have been leaked accidentally by users or intentionally by malicious insiders. Any comments
One thing
here,
I
Vic?
would, yeah, I'd add on to this. If you've seen any of my blogs in the past, I joke around and say we don't eat our own dog food here, which is commonly said when a vendor uses their own solution. Our joke is we eat our own barbecue. So we use Searchlight for us internally, and for us, we get a lot of the malicious domains and get alerts on those, and then we pipe those out to our security prevention controls and things like that to block those things. We also get quite a bit on credentials, and then it'll be validated and say, hey, these are old credentials. They've been out there for a while. They're just being resold. Code leakage is something new. Now we've got some new releases on there, but GitHub coverage, GitLab coverage as well. Looking for, in our case, what we find is, someone just used a Digital Shadows email address on a personal, not work-related thing that triggers on it. But one area where you get a lot of success from our service is something called, I mentioned it before, with the domain registrations for COVID is shadow search. So what we use shadow search for is a lot of that third-party risk monitoring. We plug in our top vendors that we want to monitor. Let's say hypothetically it was Zoom or WebEx or whatever. And then anytime there's open source reporting, we'll get alerts on it. If we see something in credentials that comes up related to it, we'll get alerts on that as well. So we definitely eat our own barbecue and leverage these services from Digital Shadows as a customer of Digital Shadows. And it's helpful before, and it will be helpful in this, everyone's working beyond a perimeter world as well.
Indeed, and we definitely like barbecue. Cool. Next on the list is browsing protection. Browser is another significant threat vector, attack vector that attackers and adversaries use extensively. So in an environment, in a reality where remote workers use the corporate or even their own machines, browser protection needs to be in a very high position on the security recommendations priority. So browser native hardening should be always a top priority, with an always updated browser and patch management program aiming at browser as a top priority. Extensions whitelisting is another good example of successful browser protection enhancement, in a way that extensions have been extensively used as attack vectors and combined with social engineering affecting end users by installing malicious extensions and gaining access through them. URL filtering also in a cloud-based approach is also something that needs to be in place and highly recommended, in a way that this can replace or work in parallel with the traditional URL or internet gateway. So now the gateway is position is located in on the cloud. So with cloud-based DNS inspection solutions, the end user can have a much better protection protected environment, at least with common and known malicious websites. Last on the list, but not least, it's also very important, and it's gaining much more popularity and reputation lately, is the remote browsing isolation, which is a technique where the end user is connected through a secure connection channel to, again, a cloud-based or remote premises browser-hosted instance or solution, where anything related with browsing, including native code execution at the client side, being run and executed remotely away from the user's environment, away from the local network.
One thing I want to add on to this one, is the extensions. We did a big project last year. ISTE is heavily involved in it. You think about attack surface and you think about third-party risk. You know, if I'm using a browser extension from WebEx, I would assume that it's got better security than others. We still did an assessment of that. But there's a lot of browser extensions that are one-off shops you've never heard of, could be at risk, things that developers might use, whatever the case may be. But I really think this one ties really well into attack surface. Those extensions are attack surface. You need to inventory them. You need to control which ones can be used in the environment. I just found we've had great success in well, I'll say locking down, attempting to lock down, because nothing's ever perfect. I want to knock on wood there, but I definitely recommend you take a look at your extensions.
Yes, that's a very good point. Next on the list is the encrypted communication, and we raised that even if someone or most of us could consider that as a given, as something expected. Given the pace and the urgency that many organizations moved from traditional offices environment to remote working model, VPN was not in place. So VPN was used extensively and in many cases in a misconfigured way to support remote working. The point here, what we want to raise is, despite the fact the VPN does not align with the zero trust architecture or model, it is something that every organization should consider and have in place, either in a hybrid approach when there are resources or services supported or hosted in on-prem own data center or IT environment, and for those organizations that do not have the maturity to embed immediately cloud services, or they do not have the policy ready, or whatever the requirements, maybe regulatory issues, cannot adopt to a zero trust model. So VPN, it is something that needs to be used instead of RDP or other remote communication technologies that by far are less secure compared to VPN.
Wait a minute. Are you saying that like RDP just exposed to the internet is a bad idea?
What? Can you repeat that?
RDP exposed to the internet is a bad idea?
It should not be an idea at all. Okay, cool. Yeah, the point with encrypted communication, okay, is also that what we need to make sure that it's not only VPN that offers encrypted communication, but also in the cloud service with SSL and TLS end-to-end encryption, it is there. So even if the limitation of trusted zone through not use of VPN can be replaced or equally implemented through end-to-end encryption at the application, the SSL level. And the last security control we recommend is the popular user security awareness. Will always be a top priority, and especially now that the user's environment and working experience is changing fundamentally, we need to support and promote successful and very intense security awareness training programs, educational programs, starting by highlighting the risks of remote working, maybe something we did now during our presentation, exposing and highlighting the risks and what are the increased threats. Also train the users on how to use the new tools that we have introduced to the new remote working environment, tools for collaboration, for project management, for file sharing, anything that can be used to facilitate and support the business function can also pose a high security risk. So we need to make sure that users know how to use the tools, avoiding what we have described before, the accidental sensitive data exposures. And last, since phishing has been increased and still remains the #1 attack vector, we need additional phishing awareness education programs, additional testing campaigns, using COVID-19, which is actually the reason behind the change for remote working environment, in a way to make the users more aware of the increased risk that they are facing with the new environment. Any comment here, Rick? That was the last control.
No,
Actually,
just go ahead and click through, and I'll wrap us up, and then we'll move to Q&A. All right, so kind of key takeaways, and I'm actually going to answer one of the questions that's come in as I go through this slide because it's related. Key takeaway obviously is zero trust architecture. Full disclosure, I was a Forrester analyst. I worked on a lot of zero trust research 5 to 8 years ago, so I was heavily involved there. I have a bias towards zero trust, but I think the principles are appropriate and good nonetheless. Obviously, getting more visibility and into the attack surface more broadly, no matter what that endpoint is important. And then the last one is actually where I would start off. One of the questions that came in was, what's the first problem that organizations try to solve for in this new normal? How do you get started on some form of zero trust? I think a risk assessment is where you should start. We've rushed to get people working remotely. Take a look at that. What applications, what infrastructure, what endpoints are they using? How are they connecting? And start to look at that. I am a big fan of the identity component of zero trust. Izzy and I had some conversations between like attack surface, identity, where do we start off, that sort of thing. Personally, I think a risk assessment is where you should start, and then kind of build a plan on what the biggest risks are. But I like identity. Identity is the new perimeter, as I forgot who said that, Wendy Nather, I can't remember who said that, but that's where I would recommend that you start. I don't, Izzy, would you add anything on to that specific question that I'm kind of pre-answering before the Q&A piece?
No, actually, just to support that in terms that the risk that threat modeling, what we've done now actually in a very light way. Threat modeling involves analysis of many more threats, associated impact, is part of a risk assessment process. So I totally agree with you that a good starting point, it is the risk assessment in order to identify what are the critical assets and how they are threatened by the new reality, by the new environment.
One of the things I mentioned CBEST earlier on the call, I wasn't familiar with CBEST until I joined Digital Shadows, but CBEST comes out of the Bank of England. It started with the financial service companies. It's actually expanded to other countries as well under different names, but they have some crown jewels analysis that's a key component of that, and then how my adversaries target that. So it's part of the CBEST threat modeling, and I like that process as just one example. I like this. This is
I would like.
Oh, go ahead, Izzy.
Yes, I just would like also to add to this response that we insist on risk assessment because it actually will highlight which of the security controls that we have presented an organization needs to address, to implement first. Okay, so that's why there is not any easy answer. Okay, this control is the first one that you should go for. This is the second, and so on. Threat modeling and risk assessment will highlight and will do and offer that priority list to the owners, to the companies.
Let's go ahead and click through because I want to make sure we have time for more questions. So one of the things that Izzy and I wanted to give you was kind of like a take-home page. So we have a number of different resources here that you can follow up on. We put the blog that Issy wrote 2 weeks ago that we did a lot of the content today on. We've got some SANS material, some NIST material. We have the Microsoft Zero Trust Assessment that Issy had when he started his section. And then we also listed out two very influential people in the world of Zero Trust. One's John Kindervag, a local Texan, actually a mentor of mine, who created Zero Trust. He's now at Palo Alto Networks. Chase Cunningham followed John on when John departed and is currently carrying the Zero Trust mantle for Forrester. John just published something yesterday on the Zero Trust module, Zero Trust model that's quite useful. So take a look at their content. Next slide.
Nice.
So one thing you may or may not be aware, we do have a weekly podcast called Shadow Talk. Sometimes we do multiple episodes a week. Our standard episode, there's 3 or 4 of us. We rotate between London and Dallas, and we talk about the headlines. You can kind of see here one of our recent ones. We talked about third-party risk in mobile apps in this particular one. Dark hotel, South Korean operators there. We also had another one on remote workers where we talked about that stuff. So sign up for that. We have special guests. I'm actually trying to get John Kindervag on the podcast to talk about the origin story for Zero Trust. Next one, Issy. And the last real slide I have for questions is if you're interested in kicking the tires, you can get access for 7 days. In just 1 second, Dustin's going to start a poll. But you could actually get into Shadow Search, look around Shadow Search, set up some alerts and things like that, and do some of the monitoring examples that we spoke about.